they might be surprised at the result, and it might not bode well if they try to escalate. I don't think the PLA wants to try to fight the U.S. military right now. I think that they're way underprepared. They might have more ships, but they don't have the training. They don't have the experience. They don't have the wherewithal to deal with a full up Western military. They haven't had a war since 1979, and the U.S. unfortunately has had several wars since then. And so I think it would be a grave mistake on their part. But if they do it, they might get slapped really hard, and the end result might be that they go back to the little cave and figure out what they did wrong, and all their planning goes out the window.
Good. So we have the region here awakening, although I would say a decade too late. Well, definitely the US has a different attitude, but Europe is lacking. My question here would be, China is definitely, not so much China, the CCP has been for a long time at a war with the West. The West doesn't see it that way. Okay, so what do you think can, let's say, the European Union do? Because Americans already woken, so are Asians. What about Europe? How can the West cope with it? And I mean also another issue. The PLA is extremely aggressive, so they target their lasers at the, Australian, Filipino, US units, not only in Asia, also around Djibouti. So maybe you could combine that. How could the Western militaries react, and how could the Western societies react? How could they counter China?
So first, I would argue that the first level of countering them is at the ideological level, which is to provide evidence that the CCP does not intend to peacefully expand its power, and that it's aggressive. That's the first thing to realize. The balloons were a perfect example of this. And Americans were very upset that there was a reconnaissance balloon that flew over most of the United States at the center, and then off to the East Coast. So these events should be amplified so that people understand that there's a threat. These balloons are not innocent; they're not weather balloons. That is CCP propaganda. Okay, so that's the first level, is the ideological part, that the CCP is not a friendly country, and the second level is the economic warfare that the CCP is conducting. In other words, they use their economy as a weapon to coerce countries, companies, and individuals to comply to their edicts. In other words, they want everyone to kowtow, which means to comply, to bow down to their policies. For example, I gave the example of Lithuania, that Lithuania just changed the name from Taipei to Taiwan Representative Office, and the CCP went ballistic. And this is a behavior of an immature country that can't stand anyone doing anything that they don't like, and they haven't quite figured out how to be diplomats in the real world, because they've been so insular for the last several centuries. So that's the second level, is the economic and financial level, and they use that weapon to both bribe or to help their cause, or they use it as a coercive weapon by, as I mentioned before, using it as a means to prevent the economic growth in other countries. If you don't comply, you don't have business with us, etc. And sort of the overall last level is this military aspect. They are expanding their military power, as you mentioned, in Djibouti. They're testing. They're using Lenin's edict, which is you have a bayonet and you thrust. If you hit mush, you keep on pushing. If you hit steel, you withdraw. That's Lenin. That's exactly what communists do. They keep on pushing and pushing and pushing, and if people don't push back, they just keep on pushing. They'll push you over. The CCP is very aggressive, but that aggressiveness is actually a detriment in some respects. As I mentioned, taking over Hong Kong, conducting exercise around Taiwan, using economic warfare against countries for not complying with their wishes. So the way that Europe wakes up is when, for example, it is revealed that China has been helping Russia. We know that they have been helping them in a non-military sense, and the U.S. government recently came out with a warning to China saying, if you supply weapons to Russia, this is not a good thing, implied threat, and if they are caught providing weapons, then Europe will wake up, because they'll realize that the communist China is on the side of Russia, which is not the side that Europeans are on, and the Europeans are going to have to wake up to the fact that they might have to have some economic costs for dealing with China, and that might be painful, but they might have to make a decision of which way to go. I had a question in December. I was in a conference, and there was a European academic who said, "Oh, Europe can't do anything if Taiwan is attacked by communist China." And I said, "No, Europe can do. If Europe doesn't want to supply weapons or help a blockade or some kind of a military type action against China, they can do an economic blockade, as we mentioned before, on the food side. If the G7 conduct an economic blockade of communist China, preventing, for example, 100 million tons of soybeans from getting into China, which is what they import every year from Argentina, from Brazil, from the United States, then their food will go down, and they won't have food to feed their animals, and they won't have food to feed themselves. So Europe can play a part, and I know that they're reluctant to play a part, but this is an area that they can play a part. And it will show unity in effort. And I think that Europeans have interests here in Asia. For example, as you probably know, France has a huge territory in the Pacific that they own. The British have Commonwealth countries in Asia. Australia is not a small country. So these countries in Europe have interests in Asia. A lot of these countries have connections to their former colonial past, and so they have a big interest in making sure that their economies are stable and their allies are stable. And if they kowtow to the communist China, then they won't bode well in the future when the rest of the world is not on the side of China.
Still, I'm kind of reluctant when I see the European reaction with Russia, and I think maybe Europe needs a incident like you had just in the US with a balloon, something really that is just in your face. But so far, I really, when I look at bureaucrats, they don't really seem that determined. But that's one aspect. The other one that I asked about is the military aspect, when the PLA challenges foreign units, targeting them with lasers, ramming boats, ships. So what about that? Like, why doesn't anyone respond to that, just takes it?
I mean, I would reflect back to the incident that happened, I believe, in 2000 or 2001, when the EP-3, a U.S. Navy aircraft, was flying along in international waters, along the coastline of China, and you had a fighter jet, a PLA Navy fighter jet. Two of them intercept this plane, which is normal to intercept. meaning they come up within let's say 100 meters or more, maybe 500 meters is more safe. And there's a protocol that most countries in the world follow, which is they don't do anything to disrupt the aircraft that's flying along their border, but they just monitor it and make sure it doesn't turn in or go into their airspace. But in this case, the pilot, the PLA Navy pilot, decided to do some antics and ended up getting his wing clipped by this airplane. The Navy EP-3 is a propeller-driven airplane, so it's not fast and it's just flying level and steady. And this jet, which is flying much faster, decided to get too close to the airplane. The jet has much more maneuverability than this aircraft with four engines, and so the result was the EP-3 had to do an emergency landing because of the antics of this stupid pilot, and the pilot died. Okay, so these are that incident shows that either the pilot was motivated by his own personal, let's say, his own ego, or he was told to be aggressive against this EP-3, and the consequence was American Navy personnel were landed on the island of Hainan and were not released immediately. They were held captive. Okay, and the PLA decided to find out what kinds of equipment was on that plane. That was U.S. national property, and they tore it apart. And then the U.S. government asked for it to be returned, and they said, "Well, we can't return it whole, so we're going to cut it all up and send it back to you in pieces." So, the U.S. Navy was conducting, according to international law, lawful transit of international airspace, and the PLA decided to be aggressive, and that was really stupid. And I think they paid a huge negative dividend against their image as being professional. And so I think that the reason, getting back to your question, I think the reason why most militaries are not responding in kind because it's not professional. And I think that these other militaries are taking the high ground, but it could occur something like that could reoccur, and I just think it shows immaturity, and it goes back to their training, and it goes back to their sense of I think it's lack of training and lack of understanding what is supposed to be done and what's not supposed to be done. These are antics that little boys play in a sandbox, and it's not what professional military people do when they're not at war and there's peace, and they're being either encouraged to be aggressive, or they just take it upon themselves. And I think this shows really a lack of judgment by the people involved and the leadership involved. And I think that's the message that the U.S. military and other militaries are trying to send to not only China, but to the rest of the world, saying, look, these people they're not playing by the rules, and they're not playing professionally. And so I think it's a big mistake for them to continue to pursue this kind of using lasers against pilots who are flying, or against ships, or doing antics like discharging chaff in front of a plane flying behind them to disrupt their engines. I mean, this is really dangerous. This is really dangerous activity. A lot of people could die, and it's not what you do during peacetime. I mean, these are not professional things that you do during peacetime.
I had General Stilwell here on the show who described it in detail, everything really in detail. And he even said that the superiors of those pilots they didn't know the truth. They were told and showed pictures by Americans, and then they realized there's the people in the base from where the pilot was from, they were lying to the higher echelons. They didn't tell them the truth. They just were told by the Americans. That was so bad and so embarrassing.
The Chinese military leaders said with a straight face that the P-3 maneuvered violently and crashed into our best fighter. It's impossible. That is absolutely impossible to do. They're assuming that they're on a level road and he swerved into him and he got out of the way. What these guys don't know, because they're all Army, is that in that case, you just go up. Fighters can go up or down, right? So if somebody's going to get in your way, you just pop up and go over them. But their leader, the Air Force leaders, told their senior leaders that were dealing with the U.S. that the Navy P-3, a big lumbering 1950s airliner, somehow maneuvered violently and crashed into their premier indigenous fighter. And they believed that.
But still, I would challenge you here a little bit. I'm not sure this is really highbrow. Like when the PLA is allowed to do all that, they probably take it as West's weakness, and that's probably how the societies see it in the end. So I'm not sure that's the right strategy. I'm afraid this would lead to another incident, and then it might spiral out of control.
Yes, I mean, you're right. It definitely could spiral out of control. But my question to General Stilwell would be: were any of the superiors of those pilots in the example that I just gave, were any of them fired? Were they demoted? Were they removed from their position? I doubt it. And I'm not so sure that they were surprised. Okay, I mean, they could be lying about their reaction. Oh, we didn't know. Oh my gosh, it's so bad. That kind of a scenario. I don't really trust their motivation or their story, because they've been known to be very cutthroat in terms of what they do, and of course, again, the CCP. The PLA works for the CCP. The PLA does not work for the Chinese people. So if it was something seriously against their protocol, those people would have been fired and it would have announced that this is unacceptable, blah, blah, blah. I don't recall that ever happening. So I'm doubtful. I believe General Stilwell, and he says that these officers appeared to not know about what really happened, but I also believe that they could have been lying in the reaction, and therefore they knew the truth, and nobody was punished for it, because, as you say, maybe they're being encouraged to be aggressive and to try to spark an incident. Maybe
I understand.
Maybe it's a weakness for militaries not to respond in a more aggressive way to their aggression. Don't forget, militaries are aggressive beings. They're aggressive animals by nature. There's a huge potential for destruction, death and destruction. So if the PLA continues to pursue this, you're right, there will be an incident, and the consequences could be very bad. And I think they could be very bad for the PLA, because if they try to engage a Western or either ship or aircraft, they might be surprised at the result, and it might not bode well if they try to escalate. I don't think the PLA wants to try to fight the U.S. military right now. I think that they're way underprepared. They might have more ships, but they don't have the training. They don't have the experience. They don't have the wherewithal to deal with a full-up Western military. They haven't had a war since 1979, and the U.S. unfortunately has had several wars since then. And so I think it would be a grave mistake on their part. But if they do it, they might get slapped really hard, and the end result might be that they go back to the little cave and figure out what they did wrong, and all their planning goes out the window.
Yeah, the other thing I just realized while we discussed it, that since Xi Jinping took over and did an overhaul of the PLA, it's supposed to be more competent, but it seems like it didn't, because those incidents, provocations, they keep going on. So maybe in the end, there wasn't so much of a change. Maybe in quantity, yes, arms and ships and whatever, planes, but not maybe so much in quality. If we also add the corruption that's supposed to be happening there in the PLA, promotions not always based on merits, then in the end, yeah, they might be maybe a little bit like the Russian army as we thought before and after the invasion of Ukraine.
You know, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, if you think about it, the PLA, look, the military follows orders. That is what they do. So if Xi Jinping or his predecessors didn't want the military to do this kind of aggressive behavior, it would have stopped immediately. So the fact is that this continues, and as you mentioned, it's becoming more frequent. It means to me that Xi Jinping, as you know, is also head of the CMC,
yes.
The Chinese Military Commission, which controls the military. And so, if he had made an edict to knock it off, they would have done it, but they keep on doing it. So it means to me that that this charade of not knowing, there was a few soldiers or pilots who were aggressive, that to me is erroneous, and I think it's encouraged by the leadership, and that means something different than some errant pilot goofing off in the airspace.
Yeah, definitely nowadays, definitely it's on purpose. It's by design. Especially we have the Wolf warrior diplomacy on the diplomatic front, and probably that's the other one exercised by the military. I guess it's on both fronts.
They're all using Lenin's edict, as I mentioned. It's all part of the communist style of action, and it's not just in the military. It's not just in the diplomacy we mentioned earlier. In the economic arena, it's full spectrum conflict. They want to take over the world. I mean, that's clear to me.
Yes, and they say it in public. That's their goal.
Yeah. Recently, there was a senior researcher from RAND came up with an idea about how to deal with a PLA invasion scenario. He calls it blunt and hold. In other words, the idea is to prevent the PLA from coming onto the island. That's the primary focus. And then once they're able to do that, is continue to prevent them from invading, as a more of an operational strategy rather than a grand, a bigger strategy. And I think that merits attention, because a lot of the theories that are out there these days talk about, porcupine strategy. They talk about asymmetric warfare, and all these, and they're valid in a context. And the context is, if the PLA is on the island of Formosa or Taiwan, then obviously it's going to be a Ukraine type warfare on land versus land, and I think it's a mistake to focus on asymmetric only and or porcupine only strategy, because if you wait until they come to you, that means you're in a corner and you don't have much space to maneuver. You're stuck. But if you prevent them from getting you in a corner, which is a classic scenario, a street fighting scenario, you don't want to be caught in a corner, because then you have no way of escape. So in the same sense, I think the strategy that he's proposing, Dave Ochmanek, he was also in government a while too. He's a senior strategist at RAND. I think he has a good point. I think the strategy should be focused on initially. It should be a layered defense, okay, and a layered offense. In other words, not just try to prevent an invasion, but inflict pain on the CCP for conducting an invasion. Everyone talks about, sinking ships, preventing airplanes from coming, etc. But as many people know, Taiwan also has long-range missiles. And so those long-range missiles can also create pain on the CCP and make it suffer for conducting operations against Taiwan. Just like Ukraine has been asking for longer-range missile systems to prevent weapons and soldiers from entering into Ukraine, strike the railheads, and prevent the movement of weapons into Ukraine. This is the same idea that Taiwan can pursue, and I think we must never think about limiting your ability to strike the adversary. If you do that, then you're fighting with one hand behind your back, and in some cases, both hands behind your back, and that's not a good scenario. So that's kind of something that I'm exploring, is the different strategies that are being discussed around the world in terms of how Taiwan can focus on both a symmetric and asymmetric type of warfare. Because if the PLA never makes it to the coast of Taiwan, then Taiwan doesn't have to win. Taiwan just has to not lose. PLA has to win.
Yes.
So if Taiwan prevents the PLA from winning, then Taiwan wins by default. So the idea here is that it should be a layered defense and a layered offense. That's my current thinking.
Great. Thank you so much for the time and for really insightful comments. I appreciate your time very, very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.